There's also the great story that Mussolini said to the players, look, you've done a great service to La Patria. What can we give you? And some sycophant in the team says, oh, what we really want is a signed photograph of you, oh great leader. And the rest of the players are like, Christ. And so by 38, when they win it in France, and they sort of on the train home, they're like, hang on, if he asks us again, let's work out what we're going to say. We don't want another signed photo. And so they decide what we want is lifetime rail passes, which is like obviously much more useful than a signed photo of Mussolini, but equally shows just how low expectations were of the prize that you could win. So yeah, I don't know if the US players have been promised nationwide rail passes if they somehow win next summer.
This is America's Cup, how the world's favorite sporting event will meet America's own vision for it. If you engage with one single piece of content in this entire newsletter / podcast, I promise you, let it be this one. I was so honored to be able to interview Jonathan Wilson, who is really one of the best football writers out there. And I mean football in terms of the sport and the tactics and the game, and also the politics and the policy and the business surrounding it. Just to do a very quick rundown of Jonathan's biography, which is not going to do it justice, but Jonathan is a weekly columnist at The Guardian. He's written for The Guardian for more than 2 decades now. He's also written for The Independent, The Telegraph, you name it. He founded a quarterly journal called The Blizzard in 2011, which he still writes for and edits. He's a multiple award winner, including the Football Writer of the Year award multiple times. He has written what is often considered the seminal book about the history of football tactics called Inverting the Pyramid. And now he has a new book due to be released on October 28th in the US. It's called The Power and the Glory. And extremely fitting for this podcast is that it is the history of the World Cup. And I'm not just saying this, but it's such a great read. Each chapter is dedicated to one of the 22 World Cups that have happened, from Uruguay 1930 right up until Qatar 2022. And he just so effortlessly tells the story of each World Cup by blending together the contextual story of the host country's political situation and policy situation and economic situation with the football, with the games, with the tactics, with the state of football at that particular time, and then weaves in fascinating anecdotes. I'm still working my way through it. I just got done with the 1966 chapter. England has just won the World Cup for the only time in its history. Spoiler alert. And he tells this great story about the Jules Rimet trophy going missing and potential link to South London gangsters at the time. His encyclopedic knowledge is just striking. It's not just something he's done in the book. When you listen to this interview, which you will, you'll just hear how off the top of his head he will name a game from the 1986 World Cup. Just plucked out of thin air, he'll know the second group game or whatever. We had a wide-ranging chat, touching on some of the issues that I've been looking at, but through a historical lens. So what can the history teach us about what to expect in 2026? One thing I took away from this book is that each World Cup really had its own issues. It was never simple, whether it's the earthquake in Chile in 1962, where the whole World Cup had to be reorganized, essentially. Whether it's Switzerland and Sweden as the neutrals during the war having to pick up hosting duties right after the war, while the rest of Europe built back up. We touched on everything from Mussolini to OJ Simpson to Christian Pulisic, and he told some anecdotes about his coverage of the World Cup. I mean, he's been to multiple, he talks about some of his favorite World Cups and some of his favorite memories. So enough of me. Here is my chat with Jonathan Wilson. Just to start off with, Gianni Infantino has moved into Trump Tower. He was at the Gaza summit a couple days ago. From your research, has FIFA and a government ever been so closely intertwined, or is this new, what we're seeing?
No, this is completely new, and it's totally baffling and kind of ridiculous. So what's Infantino doing at the Gaza summit? You know, you didn't have Jules Rimet at Yalta. You know, it wasn't sort of Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Rimet. He's become, I mean, this is a point that my colleague Japik Brook, it's a point he's made, that he's become a bit like an old-fashioned pope. like not the 20th century popes, but like the popes of 400 or 500 years ago, when they were these sort of major pan-national figures. But why is he there? Like, has anybody explained why Infantino is there? What's he? What's the idea that like he arranges some sort of Hamas versus hostages? Here's a match for peace. It's ludicrous. The obvious close tie with Trump, I think, is not dissimilar to what he did in Qatar. But I don't think any previous FIFA president has allied themselves quite so closely to national governments. João Havelange at times was pretty opposed to the Brazilian government. He did a lot to curry favor with various African governments. Africa was his real power base, but it wasn't so specific. And it's just bizarre that it's happened so quickly and kind of without resistance. Not enough people are sort of saying, what's going on? Why is he doing this?
One of the big issues that I've been looking at is obviously you can't ignore immigration, right? We're looking at travel bans, we're looking at visa wait times, to the point where we don't know if fans will be able to get here. This is different from like Egypt missing a boat in 1930, right? This is like a big deal that's affecting so many countries. We're talking about maybe ICE agents on site. They've said that they will have ICE agents on site during the Super Bowl, so you can only think that this might happen at the World Cups. I mean, has there ever been such a hostile immigration policy around a World Cup?
I mean, there just hasn't. Look, you can find very specific examples where this is not true, but as a general rule of thumb, each of the 22 previous World Cups, the aim of the host nation was to be welcoming to the world. Now, I'll give you a very clear example of where that is not true. So Qatar, clearly, if you were gay or Jewish, that was not a welcoming environment to you. I'm aware of that. But fundamentally, even Qatar wanted to welcome people to Qatar to show off, look, this is our country. Isn't it amazing? Please go away from here and tell everybody how amazing our country is. And with Qatar, I think a very specific desire to raise awareness of Qatar's existence and importance in people's minds, partly just to make it much harder for Qatar to be invaded by its neighbours. It has been threatened at various points by Saudi Arabia, by Iran. It has natural gas reserves. It's clearly an attractive place if you were a predatory neighbor. That's why there are US troops stationed there. It's why they have French military jets, why there's a British presence there. It's about sustaining Qatar as an independent nation, and also their involvement in football, and this would include the investment in PSG. It's about gaining a place at the table, being there for global business. But fundamentally, each of the 22 countries wants people to go there, whereas that is not the sense you get from the US. And the travel ban on Iran is the most obvious example of that. So the national team will be allowed to go because they get some sort of sporting dispensation. Whether all of their backroom staff will be able to go, I think that's still unclear. But fans clearly will not be able to go. Or you look at Ecuador or Colombia, and Ecuador have qualified second in South America. This is maybe the greatest, well, almost certainly the greatest Ecuador team of all time. But the visa wait times are now so long that it's impossible for Ecuadorian fans to go to the US for the World Cup. So that's something completely new. And I think there's a very obvious contrast to 2017 when Infantino had first taken power. So what an absurd phrase that is, taken power. Had first become FIFA president. But it's telling, that slip is telling, right?
Yeah.
That he said to Putin, look, if having a World Cup ticket is not a guarantee of a visa, then we will take the World Cup off you. Infantino now is sort of, oh yeah, whatever the US wants, that's what we're going to do. So I think it's genuinely the first of the 23 World Cups that will have a host that is hostile to the outside world, or to large parts of the outside world.
And I suppose the irony being that the US and soccer culture in the US is built around immigrants. One nice thing I like about watching soccer here is that the immigrant diaspora is so diverse. You go from one city to the next, or one part of a city to the next, and you're going to have Cape Verdeans celebrating their team. Is that one of maybe the positives that the US can bring out? Is this diversity is a bad word in the States now, but is it a quiet resistance maybe that the fans can bring?
Possibly, although I imagine with ICE agents on site that might be dampened down. But if you look back at '94 and you had, for instance, Ireland against Italy in New York, and that was particularly for Ireland, but for both diasporas, that was a great opportunity to celebrate their home nations, as it were, or their original nations. So you're right, diversity clearly has been a part of US soccer right from the start. In many ways, perhaps one of the problems of US soccer, the reason that it didn't catch on in a way it did elsewhere, that it was almost seen as being, for want of a much better term, an ethnic sport. And you see that even in the NASL, that when the franchise in Toronto is in financial trouble, they're taken over by a group of Croatians and it becomes Toronto, Croatia, which the NASL hated. They were trying to move away from the ethnic teams. And, I think the Chicago franchise in late 60s deliberately was buying Polish players to try and encourage the diaspora to go. Huh. But then the danger is that there's a sense in Chicago, well, that's just for the Poles, it's not for everybody. And so I think that was something the NASL were very conscious of trying to move away from. You see this with the ASL in the 20s, that there was a real sense that American football is for people who want to express their Americanness. Soccer is for people who are quite happy being an Irish American, an Italian American, a Polish American, whatever. I think the issue of diversity has been a complicated one for many reasons for soccer in the US all the way through. But I think it becomes massively complicated now. And I think you even see with the US national team in certainly the 70s, but I think maybe even into the 80s, that when they played Mexico in qualifiers, they would play it in LA because that's the way you get the crowd. But you kind of sacrifice home advantage by doing that, which is a kind of a slightly odd dynamic. So yeah, immigration has been a factor in US soccer all the way through, but that's now presenting in quite a troublesome way, I think.
There's so many geopolitical tensions right now, including with the co-hosts, right? Including with Mexico and Canada. Those have maybe died down a little bit since Carney came into power, but there was talk of the 51st state and all this. He's picked fights with allies, Denmark, Colombia, and then, of course, you mentioned Iran's going to be at the tournament. We've seen geopolitical, I suppose, matches play out. We've seen USA-Iran a couple of times. Has there ever been a tournament with quite so much geopolitical tension? And, other than USA-Iran, have there been any other geopolitically tense matches?
Yeah, I mean, England and Argentina in '86 is a big example of that. I mean, the war was over, there was a different government in Argentina, but the Argentinian response to the Falklands conflict is odd in the sense that they kind of know their government was being absurd and sending barely trained 17-year-olds into battle. That's clearly the Argentinian government's fault. It's not the British Army's fault for then killing them. A war's a war. I mean, I'm in Argentina right now, but it's really striking how often you see memorials. I was in a bar in La Boca yesterday doing an interview, and just inside the door, there's an Argentinian flag with the map of the Malvinas on it. And so it says something like, La Boca will never forget the sacrifice. Or I went down to Puerto Madryn in Patagonia last week, and Truen, which is the airport you fly into, which is Welsh. I mean, it's a Welsh place. Huh. There's plenty of Welsh troops fighting on the British side in the Falklands. But in the airport, there's a whole load of maps and diagrams and explanation of how Truen was where the part of the Argentinian Air Force was based in the invasion and the short-lived defense of the Malvinas as an Argentinian institution. So 86 absolutely was. Clearly, before that game, the Argentinian players have been very carefully prepped, saying the war has nothing to do with this. But then you read things they've said since, where it's obviously it was about that. Ozzy Ardiles, he was not playing by then for the national team, but his cousin or his nephew was killed in the Falklands. Omar Ardiles was a pilot. So that game has a very direct political sensitivities around it. But in terms of global tensions, I guess you go back to 1938, where there were 15 teams because Austria withdrew very late because of the Anschluss. And the German team at that World Cup, the order came down from on high that Sepp Herberger, the coach, you must pick a minimum of 5 players from both Austria and Germany. And as a result, they massively underperformed because the two sets of players didn't get on with each other. And also, you can't just fuse two teams together and expect it to be better than the two entities who've been working together, training together for years beforehand. So they go out in the first round to Switzerland. I think actually, in a weird way, 1938 was the World Cup at which the hosts were least present, if that makes sense. Gilles Rimet, the French president of FIFA, he had been appalled by what he'd seen in Italy in '34, and he'd been, I think, very skillful in making sure the World Cup went to France and not to Germany, which was the other European nation bidding, and it could easily have gone to Germany. But he'd seen what fascism had done to the World Cup in '34, wanted to avoid that. And so France really sort of plays down its own political involvement. But then you have incidents like, I mean, Italy basically are booed everywhere they go by anti-fascists. Italy play France in the quarterfinal. Now, Italy's normal away kit was white, but they wore black in that game. Now, they had worn black once before. It's often said that's the only time they ever wore black. That's not true. I think there were 3 occasions when they wore black. But still, they're making a point by wearing black. They're wearing the fascist colour. And that leads to a lot of protests in the stands from Italian and German expats living in France. Spain are not at that tournament because of the war. China withdraw because of the invasion by Japan. So 38 is, on a global level, a more political World Cup. On a specific level, maybe less than we're going to get next year.
Yeah, I did a story on after the Club World Cup final when Donald Trump was on stage with Chelsea and trying to lift the cup with them. It reminded me, because I was there obviously, of the 1934 World Cup and the Mussolini World Cup, and trying to figure out what role Donald Trump is going to play in this tournament, whether he's going to want to steal the limelight or kind of sit back. I know Putin in 2018 showed himself on the world stage. Is 34 really the one where the world leader has tried to be front and center?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, it's pretty standard for the local leader to hand the cup over. So the Queen hands it over in 1966. You've got Videla hands it over in 1978. I mean, Putin in 2018, that was a remarkable moment in that suddenly, just as the final whistle goes, there's this tremendous shower, incredibly heavy rain. And on that stage, you had Macron, you had Putin, and I've forgotten her name, the Croatian president, prime minister, whichever.
Can't remember.
And there was only one umbrella, but Putin had the umbrella. Like, there's no way it was going to anybody else.
Right.
And so that was a real sort of, okay, it's obvious he's got the power here. But he's just a guy handing over a cup.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more involvement in Qatar in the fact that they put the bisht, the sort of black robe on Messi, which, I mean, there's quite a lot of controversy about it. It's clearly meant to be a local honour, but that never happened previously. It's nothing to what we've seen subsequently, but I think that was an uncomfortable moment of local politics taking over the football. And you saw people trying to defend Qatar making him wear the bisht or giving him the bisht as, oh yeah, but in 86 Maradona was wearing a sombrero. Well, no, he was given the cup and he went off to celebrate, and while he's sort of running around the pitch, somebody sticks a sombrero on his head. That's a totally different scenario. He's put that on willingly. He's not been given it by a senior politician where he kind of has no option. And obviously in those photographs, you want him wearing the Argentina shirt. Everybody wants that. It's a celebration of Argentina, or both in 2022 and 1986. And Messi took the bisht off straight away, as soon as he conceivably could. But we've seen nothing like no head of state being like on the stage celebrating with the players. And it's great that Cole Palmer was the player who's right behind him.
Yeah.
Because Cole Palmer is this magnificently unfiltered figure. And you can just see him kind of go, what's going on? Who's this? What? And that confusion is just spectacular. And other players might be a bit savvier to kind of keep their face straight, but his bewilderment is absolutely clear. So, yeah, I think the comparison with Mussolini is fair in the sense that Mussolini had his own trophy designed, the Coppa del Duce, which was 6 times bigger than the Jules Rimet trophy. And it's that's handed over. It's not the Jules Rimet trophy that's handed over. I mean, you can say, look, it's only the second World Cup. The protocols weren't as ingrained. But that's the previous example, I think, of a world leader really involving himself in a ceremony. But even then, I don't think Mussolini was sort of dancing around on the stage with the Italy players. But also the great story that Mussolini said to the players, look, you've done a great service to La Patria. What can we give you? And some sycophant in the team, I forget his name, he taught Mussolini's kids how to play tennis, says, oh, what we really want is a signed photograph of you, oh great leader. And the rest of the players are like, Christ. And so by 38, when they win it in France, and they sort of on the train home, they're like, hang on, if he asks us again, let's work out what we're going to say. We don't want another signed photo. And so they decide what we want is lifetime rail passes, which is like obviously much more useful than a signed photo of Mussolini, but equally shows just how low expectations were of the prizes you could win. So yeah, I don't know if the US players have been promised nationwide rail passes if they somehow win next summer.
If they somehow build some railroads around the US.
There's two major things that have to happen for that to happen.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Sort of related to that, I also did an episode a couple weeks ago about protest and flag waving and dissent, and thinking about, is it going to be okay to like wave a Palestinian flag? In my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, something like 34 or even 82, kind of Spain trying to reinvent itself, were countries trying to paper over the cracks and maybe show the world that actually things are great. And I wonder, because Trump is so worried about what the world thinks of him, whether he's going to try to want to project that, or whether it's going to be more like a 78 where it's going to be, no, show the world we mean business and show the press that we're going to crack down on dissent. That's hard for you to speculate, yeah. But is there a parallel?
Yeah, I mean, that point about the Palestinian flags, I think is really interesting, because we had the opposite in Qatar. The Palestinian flags were totally fine.
Yeah.
But you try taking a rainbow flag, and that was getting taken off you, and you probably spend some time in a cell. Or you had the issue, it was around all the time of the protests in Iran, and the Iran players in their opening game against England didn't sing the national anthem, which was after the pretty craven collapse of a Northern European going to wear the One Love armbands. And then suddenly, oh, okay, if we're going to get booked for that, we're not going to do that. You're comparing that to the courage of the Iran players, although by the third group game they are singing it. Obviously, pressure had been applied. You'll know better than me how provocative a Palestinian flag would be in the US. But I mean, to be honest, we're seeing that even in the UK now. I think if you tried to wave a Palestinian flag at a Premier League game, I think there's certainly a chance it would be taken off you. There was where was it? Was it the Cup of Nations? Last Cup of Nations. And there was a British guy was wearing a shirt of Palestina, which is a Chilean club founded by Palestinian migrants. And he was an identity to the stadium wearing that. That was in Ivory Coast. So I think could be an issue. I mean, in some ways, FIFA has just dodged a massive bullet in regards to Palestine and Israel, in the sense that A, Palestine failed to qualify, and B, when Israel were 3-1 up against Italy last month, there was a serious chance Israel could end up in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Now, there's been movements within UEFA to ban Israel. And the analogy with Russia doesn't quite hold, because the reason Russia were banned was entirely pragmatic, was that certain countries were like, we're not going to play them. And UEFA were faced with this, hang on, could we really dock countries 3 points for refusing to play an obvious aggressor? That hasn't happened with Israel yet, but there's definitely been very serious conversations in UEFA about banning Israel. Trump, you assume, would be massively anti that. And then you have this incredibly confusing situation where you have FIFA, who are allied to Trump, and FIFA, who are bankrolled largely by Saudi Arabia now. And then you've got Saudi Arabia probably having to take a pro-Israel line in public. I mean, were they really going to do that? I know behind the scenes they haven't necessarily been as anti-Israel as might be expected, but to publicly back FIFA against UEFA who wants to ban Israel, that would have been a fascinating dilemma. But because Italy came back to win 5-4 and then Israel have lost since, from a football point of view, it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think Israel maybe technically is still in it, but I think mathematically is just not. But when they were still in it, I remember Trump saying that they would take action if FIFA tried to ban Israel. And obviously, one thing Trump's saying is that he'll try and pull games out of blue cities if they don't clamp down on law and order. He's threatened Boston, LA. I spoke to the CEO of the Atlanta Falcons and Mercedes-Benz Stadium a couple of weeks ago, who are hosting 8 games, and they've been planning this thing for 11 years, and they don't have a contingency. Can something like this happen? I mean, can the leader of a country actually override FIFA and, pull Boston's games, pull Atlanta's games?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect it wouldn't be overriding FIFA, because I think FIFA would just fall into line. You'd like to think FIFA would have some backbone and say, no, this is absurd. You're not doing this. We'll take the World Cup off you. But the truth is now the World Cup is so big, there's very few countries can host it. And you certainly can't host it at 9 months' notice. When it was a 16-team tournament, you could just about cobble something together. And, we saw this on a much, much smaller scale when the Champions League final was taken off St. Petersburg and given to Paris. And we were very, very close to a disaster that day. I was there that night. The policing was appalling. Liverpool fans trapped in a tunnel. And it's a miracle that people didn't die that night. And that's partly due to French policing. They're very bad at policing football generally. But it's also, I think, because it was done very, very quickly. So that's one game. Trying to rearrange an entire tournament, or I don't know how many games Boston or LA are meant to be hosting, but presumably sort of 9, 10, 7 or 8. Yeah. It's probably just about possible. There probably are contingency plans in place because things can happen, right? You don't need it to be a political issue that, I don't know, there's a huge fire at the stadium or something and suddenly it's not usable. They probably do have contingency plans, but I think it would be deeply uncomfortable for people. But I'm baffled that, this week we've seen Argentina's game against Puerto Rico being moved from Chicago to Fort Lauderdale, basically because of the same reason, because of ICE's involvement in Chicago. And that seems to have gone pretty much unnoticed. I'm literally in Argentina now. I haven't seen a single Argentinian person mention that. So I presume it's not getting great play in Europe either. I sort of suspect that most of the world would just sort of cheerily get on with it, but it's not a good look.
Yeah, especially when people, spend their life savings and book very particular itineraries to be in a certain place, right?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, football has a habit of changing kickoff times at late notice, and they don't really seem to care at all about fans who that costs. I mean, the other thing I think is slightly odd, and I'm surprised it hasn't come to more of a crisis than it has, is the fact that the opening game's in Mexico. I mean, does Trump know that? Because For a moment, when somebody tells him, I'm sort of thinking there might be a sense that that might end up getting moved. And I say that as somebody who I think probably will be going to that first game in Mexico City. But the fact that you have a draw was moved at fairly late notice in Las Vegas to the Kennedy Center,
Yeah.
which clearly is a pro-Trump move. We saw this at the last World Cup. They literally, the day that they launched the 100 Days to Go advertising campaign, certainly in London, buses, taxis are covered with this 100 days to the World Cup. I presume it was the same around the world. On that day, they moved the opening game. So it was actually 99 days to the World Cup because they
Oh, that's
realized
right.
that
Yeah, yeah.
the opening day there's going to be 4 games, and the Qatar Ecuador game, which is going to be the third of the 4 games. And somebody obviously said, "Well, this is not normally how it works. Don't you want the host nation to sort of be the focus of everybody's attention rather than the least interesting of the 4 games?" And it's moved from the Saturday to the Friday night. Well, I mean, that advertising campaign must have cost millions. It was rendered absurd immediately.
You touched on policing. You mentioned the French policing. One thing I've been looking at is security. Obviously, the US has gun violence problems along with the geopolitical stuff that we talked about. The US does its security pretty heavy-handedly. It's going to be jarring to a lot of people who aren't used to this militarized security where the response can feel almost more uncomfortable than any kind of potential threats. Have there been World Cups where security has been really intense in a way that it stifles the spirit of the tournament?
Probably not recently. It's fair to say that there were security concerns over every tournament since Germany in 2006. But South Africa, obviously, the crime rate is very high. There was a lot of gun violence there. There were a handful of incidents of people getting robbed, but I mean, it wasn't anything too serious. Brazil, similarly, again, there were quite a lot of robberies, but I don't think there's anything too shocking. Russia, I think everybody's a little bit uncertain, but actually, I think passed off absolutely fine. I would say that of the World Cups I've covered, and while being very aware of the background politics, Russia was the most fun to cover, the most fun to be around. And then Qatar, obviously, we knew as journalists that being a dissenting voice is not necessarily a safe thing to do in Qatar, but being in the World Cup environment, it kind of gave you that insulation that you knew that if a journalist were to be arrested, the backlash would be so deafening that something would happen.
Yeah.
But still, it was at the back of your mind. Normal fans wouldn't care about that. Why would they? The other thing that's a concern is kind of the opposite. What we saw the Copa America final between Argentina and Colombia 2 years ago, when the stadium was clearly overcrowded, something clearly went badly wrong with security. I know that was a CONMEBOL. They were running security rather than necessarily the local organisers. But that footage of fans are climbing into air conditioning ducts, I realised that it was a different authority, but that did not paint a great picture of stadium security in the US.
You know, another thing I've been thinking about is how expansive geographically this tournament is. I think it's probably the largest and obviously spread across 3 countries and in a very car-heavy culture as well. The only other one I can think of that was shared across countries, and correct me if I'm wrong, was Japan, South Korea.
That's right, yeah.
Were there logistical issues with that one in terms of transport and travel?
No, not really. I mean, obviously, the 2 countries are quite a long way apart. So if you were
Yeah.
trying to flip between one country and the other, it was involving significant flights. But the truth is, the local transport, the train system in Japan particularly, is incredible. So moving within the country was absolutely fine. You basically picked which side you were doing, which half of the draw you were doing, and you stuck to that. I mean, Russia, huge geographical distances, but also the train network there is really good. And the habit of getting night trains, which is actually a really nice thing to do. I went from Nizhny Novgorod to Kazan on a night train, and that was one of my favorite World Cup memories. You're in this carriage, I don't know how many beds are on the carriage, like 30, something like that. One guy, I think Russia v Egypt was the game, and he was able to get it on his phone. So it was like about 20 of us, all with a beer or a Coke or whatever, crowded round watching this game on his phone, and people of all different nationalities. And it was a real kind of, this is what the World Cup's meant to be. It's meant to be nations coming together. Every country presents its own issues. There's going to be a lot of flights in this tournament, but as you alluded to, that concerns me less than the car-heavy nature and how do you get to the stadiums. And the fact that we were talking earlier about Boston having games taken off it. It's not Boston, it's Foxborough.
Yeah.
And having made that mistake going to an MLS game in 2000, I know just how far Foxborough is from Boston. It's not Dallas, it's Arlington. It's
right.
So I don't quite know how that's going to work. I presume they'll put on some kind of shuttle buses. You just have to hope they work and that they're fairly comfortable. And from a journalistic point of view, that they have Wi-Fi and things, you can actually work on the bus. I mean, Qatar was obviously the exact opposite. That everything was within an hour of Doha. And even there, getting Al Bayt was the stadium that was furthest away, and it wasn't on the metro. So that was a bit of a hassle. You had to sort of walk for 45 minutes, 50 minutes to get to the place where you could get Ubers. And then it was another sort of 30, 40 minutes in an Uber. Grand scheme of things, it's not huge, but it was an irritation. From a journalistic point of view, the problem in Doha was you ended up doing a game every day because you could. And that became utterly exhausting. I think this World Cup will be exhausting for different reasons, in that every other day you'll be taking a 3, 4, 5 hour flight plus time in airports, and that'll be debilitating and exhausting. Again, I don't think fans are particularly going to be bothered by that. Although obviously fans who want to go to all 3 group games of their nation, there is going to be a certain amount of travel there. But I think it should be fairly manageable, although environmentally, obviously, it's disastrous.
How does this feel to you in comparison to USA 94? And I mean, in terms of the state of soccer in America. Obviously, soccer's grown quite a bit. I know that just from my local bars that people go to watch Premier League at 7:30 in the morning and people are wearing soccer jerseys everywhere. But is it where you would have thought 30 years on? And during this World Cup, what could really boost soccer in the States? Last time it was, well, a couple of times we've seen England, USA, and we thought, oh, that'll really get people going. And they're always just like shitty matches.
Yeah. And even the US beating England in 1950, literally zero impact. Like, barely mentioned in US papers back then. I think in 94 there was a lot of concern of would people go to games. I think they will go. The pricing might mean that some games are half full, but fundamentally people in the US like an event, they will go to it. I don't think there's any necessary correlation between that and suddenly going to MLS games. I think a problem that US soccer has always had, and this goes right back to the 1920s, is interest in seeing big foreign teams is bigger than interest in seeing domestic games. That the biggest attendances in the US have always been for friendlies involving a touring foreign side. For a long, long time, the highest attendance at a US soccer match was Hakoach, which was a Zionist team from Vienna, who played against a sort of combined New York team in 1926, I think, possibly 1927, which was 40-odd thousand at the Polo Grounds. And that wasn't surpassed until the Cosmos were at their peak. But really, people were going to see Pele. They weren't going to see the Cosmos. And once they began to fade, that interest wasn't sustained. People hadn't become massive soccer fans overnight. They were fans of the experience of going to see the Cosmos and everything that entailed, all the sort of razzmatazz and glitz and celebrity players who were there. The interest in celebrity seems to be the big thing. And even with Messi, that seems to be what people are fired by. They haven't become massive Inter Miami fans overnight. They just wanted to go and see Messi. Now, clearly there are some fans of the actual soccer as well, but it just seems a culture where developing the sort of following that football has in the UK or most of Europe is, maybe it's too late, maybe the other sports have got there first, but the dynamic seems very, very different. If you look back at 94, you look at the build-up, there's loads of columns saying this sport's un-American, why is it coming here? I think it's George Vasey in the New York Times saying, this is the most popular sport in, I think he sort of said Colombia, Uzbekistan, Cameroon, as if these are absurd nations. Why are we bothering with their favourite sport? Like, nobody's saying that. I assume nobody's saying that now. There is an acceptance that this is a big global phenomenon. And even if it's not the US's favourite sport, it is still a big deal. Yeah, the opening ceremony in 94, this is one of those coincidences that when you're writing a book, it's just, this is a godsend. That opening ceremony happened on the same day as the OJ Simpson car chase.
No way.
Which obviously completely overshadows it, as it would. But in terms of this is what the US really cares about, it cares about a former NFL star who almost certainly committed murder being chased through the streets of LA. Do they care about that, or do they care about Diana Ross and B-52s and whoever else was at the opening ceremony? No, they care about OJ Simpson. I suspect we won't have anything similar to that going on.
We will have a halftime show this time.
We will have a halftime show, which is a lurch into Americanism that I think a lot of people will be resistant to. Personally, if I don't really mind that, except I think halftime should be 15 minutes. I don't know why we're changing that. But if you can fit a halftime, it's been perfectly common at English games. When I first went in the 80s, it was very normal that the local police dogs were put on a display at halftime. Whatever your local thing is, do that at halftime, but halftime's 15 minutes. And the idea of extending that does change something fairly fundamental about the game, that players have more time to rest. People who are better versed in this than me can tell me whether that's actually dangerous for muscles, that muscles will cool down too much and they have to do another warm-up. I don't know about that, but it's definitely a change that I'm not comfortable with. So what could lead to huge growth in the future? I guess probably if the US goes deep, I have to say that looks fairly unlikely at the moment. But yeah, hosts tend to overperform, so maybe. And Pochettino, for all his recent problems, I think is a very good manager. But equally, he's hampered by what's gone before. He's hampered by the culture. I mean, essentially, population times wealth tends to equal, and I guess football history tends to equal how good you will be. Well, the US is below that curve. And I think there's huge numbers of reasons for that. But just to sort of skim through them, the fact that football, for all kinds of reasons, came late, that it wasn't the preeminent sport, the fact that it's a very good book written, I think it was in response to the failure to qualify for 2018, book by a guy called George Dorman called Switching Fields. And he outlines the problem. I spoke to Carly Lloyd about this as well, and she was saying that she got into soccer by playing in New Jersey with some Turkish kids in the local park. But she said that was really rare, that those sort of kick-arounds that in the UK we're very used to. That's literally what I did every morning, every night, every weekend between the ages of like 4 and 18. I played football all the time. It was still rubbish, but people who weren't rubbish got good by doing that. That seems just not part of the culture, that if you want to play, you have to join a club. We're pretty fortunate in the UK that we have an understanding that there should be a place for people who are quite bad at a sport. So there's all kinds of levels, whereas it seems other countries, in the US particularly, you have to be quite good for it to be worthwhile. They're quite expensive for clubs. And that means you're getting a certain tier of society, that they're dominated by white middle-class people. That means that people from the Black or Latino community are sort of shut out. And even when clubs try to offer scholarships to those kids, there's resistance from the middle-class parents to their kids mixing with them. And then you also have a mentality of, well, I'm paying however many $100 a year for you to coach my kids. Show me how they've got better. And the problem is that technical ability or tactical awareness, which are the two most important things, they're really hard to measure. But what you can measure is sprinting speed. You can measure how heavy a weight they can lift. And so US soccer becomes very focused on physicality. And you look at US players in Europe, you look at Christian Pulisic, can run all day, he's nice and strong, but he doesn't have the brain of a great player. And if you look at the US national team, it's full of very disciplined players who are very physically strong. And maybe the heat will suit them, but they're not playing the game in a high level way that, say, an Argentinian would.
Right, yeah. Just in terms of what we might see on the pitch, in terms of the game at the moment, I'm at the stage in the book right now in the 60s where you talk a little bit about Catenaccio and anti-football, and I'm just trying to think of some of the tournaments that France 98 was the first one I really remember. And I remember that being pretty high scoring. And then I remember South Africa being very low scoring and the football just not being that great. Like, where are we at right now? And tournament football is always a funny one, right? It's always a bit frantic. But what can we expect to see in terms of style on the pitch?
Well, I think South Africa was a unique case because of the ball. I think the ball was terrible and players couldn't control it. So basically anybody who wanted to pass the ball in the air couldn't do it. The ball was wobbling all over the place. The ball was too round. The reason a golf ball has dimples is because you need the air resistance to make it controllable. They created a ball essentially without air resistance or with minimal air resistance, and so it wobbled. And I think there's even some idea of this is good because it means goalkeepers can't judge it. But actually, it means incredibly gifted footballers can't judge where it's going to go. So I think that wasn't really a tactical issue. It becomes a tactical issue because Spain win because they're a team who play low, short passes where the impact of the ball doesn't make much difference. I think we've seen pressing come more and more into international football. I think there was a long spell when international coaches, with limited time to work with their squads, they went for the lowest common denominator, which was sit men behind the ball, don't concede, see what happens. I think the last 2 or 3 tournaments, we've seen that begin to change, begin to open out. I think it's quite likely we have a regression, partly because of the temperature, that you can't press all the time in high heat. The same way we saw Mexico in 1970, there was a regression from 66. It made the football more open, but in terms of tactical sophistication, it was a regression. I think the dilution in quality caused by the expansion will lead to more teams plonking men behind the ball, looking to keep a score down, and maybe we get something from a set play. I think generally we've seen over the last couple of years, football has become more direct, has become more focused on set plays. That may play into England's hands. Traditionally, that's a strength. But I think the lack of time available in the calendar for top clubs means that they've simplified how they play. They've been forced to simplify it. Set plays are something that you can work on and they will be sort of universally applicable. Whereas trying to play this complicated positional game of Guardiola, where you're very responsive to the opposition, you have to devise new plans for every opponent. There's just not the time to put that into practice on the training field. Guardiola's spoken about modern football has to be more direct, more about players running with the ball. So I think we will see that. But it's also true, tournaments often develop a mind of their own. If the first 3 or 4 games are really open and high scoring, it's quite likely the tournament will be open, high scoring. It's odd how it feeds off itself like that. But if you look back at, say, 2014, and the first game, Brazil beat Croatia 3-1, was pretty good, pretty open game. I think, was it Cameroon, Mexico the next game? And then the third game was that incredible Netherlands-Spain 5-1.
Oh, yeah.
And that suddenly was everybody, this is what we got to do. This is the football of this World Cup. So, who knows? If the first 2 or 3 games are 3-3 classics, we might have a tournament of 3-3 classics. If they're grim and grinding 0-0s, 1-0s, we might have a tournament of grim and grinding 0-0s, 1-0s.
Okay, fingers crossed then for those opening games. Last thing, Jonathan, and then I know you're busy, so I'll let you go. I guess two-parter. One thing I've learned from reading your book is that all World Cups have issues, have political issues and logistical issues, maybe more than I kind of realized. So when you look at 2026, does it just feel like another one of those, or does this feel different? And then the second part of that, are there any World Cups that have maybe overcome some fear and really shone through and become, actually, this was a really great World Cup?
So, the first point, as we touched on earlier, it's different because of the sense of hostility to outsiders. I think it's different because of the scale of it. We just haven't had a tournament of this size before. I think we don't know. I suspect the difference between the 32nd best team in the world and the 48th best team in the world is not huge, but we'll see that. And obviously, even if it isn't huge, it means you're still getting more of the weaker sides. And to what extent does that dilute quality? What you don't want, and I fear it's what we might get at times, is games either 6-7-0s, or more likely it's 2-0, but it's a complete walkover 2-0 when nothing happens. The stronger side scores 2 goals in the first 25 minutes. That'll do. It's very hot. Let's calm down. Let's kill the game. And it's just not a spectacle. That's a danger. I think the sheer number of fixtures risks a dilution, not just of quality, but also of spectacle. That previous World Cups, people like me, I would watch every single game, at least until you get to the bit where the game's played simultaneously at the end of the group stage. Certainly journalists, I imagine a lot of fans, would know every score of every game. And they'd know what the situation was in every group. Can you do that with 12 groups, or is that too much? I think we've seen it happen with the modern Champions League, that it's too much information to store. And that sounds like it's a nerd's point. But actually, if you don't know the information, you don't know the context, it's very hard to know how important the game is. So I think that's a danger, that we're reaching a point where we just have games and the games don't mean that much. And that, I think, could have very severe consequences for the World Cup. Then in terms of tournaments that have overcome big difficulties, it's very different difficulties, but I guess you look at Chile in 1962 with the earthquake. They had to scale back. I think they're going to have it in like 10 different cities or something. They scaled it back to 4, all within sort of an hour or so of Santiago. I don't think that was a great tournament by any means. I don't think the facilities were great. But equally, in the same way that the Olympics in 48 in London was not a big, glitzy, glamorous Olympics, it was the austerity Olympics, but people understood that there was bigger things at stake. I think football's probably lost that sense these days. But Chile overcame it. Or you kind of go back to Russia. The danger of saying this is it sounds like I'm trying to deny what Putin subsequently did, or how useful the World Cup was for him in terms of raising his prestige and raising the prestige of Russia. But in terms of how it was experienced on the ground, the World Cup in Russia was great. Everything worked. The trains worked. I first went to Russia in 1992, and I've been, I don't know, a dozen times since. And I'd seen Russia develop and develop and develop. And 2018, that must be the best the Russian middle class has ever had it. They were going on holiday all around the world. They had really nice restaurants, really nice cafes. That has to be the best time to be a middle class Russian there's ever been. And you sort of got that sense, and the World Cup was part of that. Now, obviously, there's been a regression since, as the Russian economy's been hit by sanctions and by their own actions in the war. But that was a genuinely great World Cup. Not necessarily a great champion, but there's some really great games in that tournament. And that was not necessarily the expectation we had in the weeks leading up to it.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time. This is a pleasure for me because I've followed your work for a while, so I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much. It's very kind.
That's about it for today. Thanks so much for joining again. My newsletter, talibvisram.substack.com/subscribe. Please do subscribe and leave a rating or review of this podcast. You can do that on Substack, or you can do it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.